You'll remember there are different types of assessments. We showed you a few examples of formative assessments that are ongoing, low-stakes ways to check in on student progress. Usually we use formative assessments to give students feedback on how to improve before a more high-stakes summative assessment, where we compare their learning to standards created from our desired learning objectives. If we want to make grading our formative assignments more efficient, and also have some standards to use for our summative assessments, one really powerful tool is a primary trait analysis, or a scoring level rubric. A primary trait rubric clarifies what student work looks like at each level of achievement. In the introduction to this unit, we shared a common concern that teachers have. How do we distinguish the B and C level work and grade those gray middle areas fairly? This is a great way to do just that. We'll talk about other ways this rubric can be useful in your teaching and address some common concerns teachers have about rubrics in a bit. But first, let's look at how a primary trait analysis is created as we think through our objectives for this assignment. So let's imagine that I have an assignment I would do in a microbiology course, and I'm asking my students to write some kind of a term research paper. This is a summative assignment for us, so I'm going to compare their work to a set of standard criteria. I'm going to lay out the major criteria for the paper and make my expectations for those criteria explicit. I know I want students to use sources. That's a major criteria for me. But thinking about that more deeply, I want this to be broader than just how the sources were used. I want them to carefully integrate and draw from quality, appropriate sources. So I'm going to change this to sources of information. But that's not really what I mean either. I care about both choice and use. At this point, I think I may need two different categories. I can see I might need to evaluate source selection and use of source. I can decide later whether I'm actually going to use both of those for a grade or whether one might just be feedback for students. For now, I'll put this here and see what happens. I'm going to start with source selection. It's always easiest to start with Excel's expectations. So if I start with the really high end, what does that look like? If a student does really well at selecting sources, what does that look like? If they're selecting great sources, then they have used more than the minimum number, but maybe that's a use. Maybe that goes down here in the use of sources. Glad I kept that one around. Back in source selection, excellent work selects academically sound sources, meaning that they are primary research, if that's what I've asked for, or they are a literature review, if I've asked for that. But they come from the right category, an appropriate category. In my field of microbiology, for this example of a research paper, they would be primary research articles from peer-reviewed journals. Next, I know I care about whether their sources encompass the range of material that's out there, that there aren't big chunks of things missing or only one way of thinking discussed. So what do I call that? Subject is well. What does that mean? How do I know what that looks like? Better might be represents multiple points of view. What else do we care about with regard to the source selection? I want students to use current data, so either the most recent available or to acknowledge a reason why older research is appropriate. I'm going to call that recent research or well-reasoned older research. No, that's really confusing. How about foundational sources are included? What else? What makes it Excel? What's the difference between Excels and meets? Well, Excels is unexpected, unexpected source, or draws from course-based materials in a new way. That's a good start. I may need to come back and add some ideas here later, but I'm going to move on to other levels. Usually the easiest thing to do next would be to go to who does not meet expectations. So if we look at that, using what we wrote for excels, we can think through what would be missing to qualify for does not meet expectations. If we start where we started with types of sources, does not meet expectations uses inappropriate types of sources, for example. Popular media or non-peer review. I can go parallel to the aspects that I consider excellent and define the opposite here. Sources represent only one view. Major points of view are missing. Either foundational or pertinent recent research missing. Now, I need to clarify that too, because I know my undergrads in this course might not know what's foundational, and they may not realize they've missed it. So how can I help them by restating it? It's important, but it's not really background information. Maybe reader can't tell where that important, what the original major ideas of the current research came from. Since it usually came from prior research, there's probably research there that's missing. So why these assumptions, concepts were originally addressed, something like that. Let's see, what haven't I dealt with in this first box? Types, multiple points of view, recent research, finds unexpected sources. I think I've already said that expected sources were not covered, but thinking back or on bad papers I've had in the past, where do well-meaning students go wrong? One possible thing I might expect is used only sources from class materials. Again, I can come back and add to this column as I think of more common errors that I find unacceptable for this criteria. Now, the hardest one is the middle, the meets expectations. Basically, I have to figure out where is the middle ground here. It's not quite excelling, but it's okay. I expect many students might include one paper that ends up that they didn't understand that it wasn't peer reviewed, that maybe they got something from there, but generally understood what sources were appropriate. I would say that the sources generally come from appropriate categories, with a small number possibly being from categories not appropriate. Actually, I want to make that explicit. I'll say sources are all from scientific journals with no more than one or two being non-peer reviewed. That deals with the types of sources. Looking for parallels in the criteria, I would consider acceptable a paper that has most points of view represented with minor omissions of either individual articles that would have been expected or one point of view missing entirely. Actually, thinking about that, how would you convey to a student who doesn't know what's foundational? They don't know what's expected, and they are thinking, I thought I got everything. How would they know where those points of view come from? When you've covered all of the perspectives that I would expect to see and what my expected sources are, you would have included at least the things that were touched on in the pre-lab readings or covered in class. That it should cover the basic points of view that then you should flesh out with your research.
For some classes or some teachers, they might need to dig into that category and split that up. That may not be acceptable in my higher level major courses, but I'd accept that in an intro or GEC course where students are less familiar with the foundational knowledge. I might need to split the middle category into two. Or rather than into two, you may feel like you need something in between excels and meets, and something else between meets and does not meet. Sometimes people need 5 categories. If you find that everybody ends up at meets expectations, but you feel like there are actually differences among those people, then that means that meets expectation needs to be 3 categories rather than 1 for 5 total. Early on, I separated out source selection from use of sources. If you want to go back and write out use of sources, you can, but the general idea is this. You can see clearly how much we've already covered with just source selection. If you combine source selection with use of sources, then it becomes really pretty confusing as to what the student has done well and what they haven't done well. If they end up at meets expectations, it could either be because they did really well at source selection and really horribly at use of sources and average out to be meeting expectations. But that's not accurate. Really, they excelled at one and did not meet expectations on the other. Or they did mediocre at both things. If your criteria start to feel like they're crowded, it's not possible for the student to know which of those things actually happened. And you know you really need 2 different criteria rather than 1. But if you're teaching a class where maybe the sources that are used are not as big a deal to you, where you have a much smaller set of expectations about those because it's not a major criteria for you, if the broader skill you value is that they are using sources and incorporating the quotes and citing them properly, it is something you want to see, but you don't want to dig into it because it's not a major objective for the assignment, then you might want to combine these criteria into 1. These criteria tell the students a lot about what you care about. If you care enough about a criterion for this kind of detail, then it should be its own thing, and it should be very clearly emphasized. It's a map for exactly what you're looking for in each paper.